This is Kenshi. Well, there's nothing quite like Kenshi. I guess it's a post-apocalyptic sandbox RPG, but that doesn't do the game much justice. It's a cult classic, and incredibly unique. It's one man's passion project, and he's totally rejected the traditional mode of what a game should be. It's an RPG, but there are no quests. It's post-apocalyptic, but it's not Earth that's been destroyed. It is a sandbox though. Big emphasis on the sand. I guess the only way to describe it is to run you through how it's played. Kenshi is a true zero to hero experience. You're placed in a barren and dangerous world, and it's up to you what your goal is. Most of the starts you can pick don't have much bearing on your whole playthrough. They're all just varying degrees of starting off with not much. From here, the world is yours. You progress through leveling up your stats, earning money, and getting a bigger squad. You can also build a base, but we'll get to that. I think anyone going into Kenshi blind would immediately assume it was abandonware. The menus are pretty jank, and the game gives you very little direction. You might even assume that there isn't anything to do, but you couldn't be more wrong. You also start out as just about one of the weakest characters in the whole game. I think bar for a single starving bandit, everything is going to be able to beat you in a one-on-one. And to make matters worse, you very seldom encounter solo enemies. You literally have to bait enemies into the town guard or find a training dummy before you can take on even the most basic enemy. That's pretty hardcore if you ask me. The thing is, I'd call this completely inaccessible, but the beauty of Kenshi is that you'll seldom die from an encounter. Even if your arm gets ripped off, you're incredibly likely to survive. Failure is a big part of the game, and it's integral to improving your character's stats. The best way to level up defense is to get punched in the face. This is pretty important to the game's whole ethos. It's hard because failure is expected, and you don't lose the game when you fail. There aren't a lot of games that are brave enough to do something like this. By now you'd probably noticed in the background footage that Kenshi has a very one-of-a-kind setting. I mentioned it was post-apocalyptic, but it's really unclear through the narrative what has happened to the world you're in. It's not Earth, but it's influenced by a lot of Japanese culture, which suggests it was colonized by Earth. The Eastern influence is mainly in the attire and the weaponry, while the rest of the world is a bit too beaten up to really distinguish any distinct styles. The world building and much of the story is told through the terrain, and my oh my, how marvelous the terrain is. The game runs on a pretty old engine, but I'm still blown away by the structures and landmarks you come across, many of which just don't have an explanation. You're left to wonder what it once could have been. The civilization that came before you was hyper-advanced, and it shows in what's left of what they built. You'll come across giant buried robots, cities built in decaying starship hulls, and even a satellite death ray. The dev really flexed his creativity here. There's a region called the Boneyards, which is full of hostile fauna and the remains of their prey. But it's also a mechanical graveyard of sorts. There clearly was a body of water here with all these rusted ship wreckages, but what kind of nightmarish calamity could have drained a whole sea? I don't know if it was intentional, but it's a seemingly antithetical way of engaging the player. The story of the world is lost, so it demands the player to imagine what once was. You get so little lore that it forces you to create your own. Again, I don't know if it's intentional, but much like the inhabitants of Kenshi, what happened is lost to time, and they can only guess and pass down their own stories. In short, the world is the product of one man's imagination gone wild. Time was his only limiter to how much he could pack into it. His lack of time shows in other ways, but we'll get to that. Kenshi is a hostile world, and the game isn't really afraid to throw threats at you that you can't handle. Like I said, there isn't really a starter enemy, so it's a trial by error process of taking on enemies and getting beaten up over and over. There's no shortage of things out to get you. The creature design, however, is probably the weakest part of the game's aesthetics, though. There are plenty of interesting humanoid enemies, but the monsters are simple. The Beak Thing and the Leviathan are the only two that really stand out to me. The Beak Thing because, well, you don't assume a giraffe-looking MF running at you is going to be an issue. And the Leviathan because it makes your jaw drop when you see it for the first time. The other mobs just seem to be variations of spiders or alien-looking variants of a real-world counterpart. They're fine, they do the job. Maybe it's the scale at which you see them that can kind of minimize their design. They all just look like bugs when you're zoomed out. What I do like about them though is that they're fucking everywhere. Their frequency really highlights that the world is a hostile place and only the toughest survive. I also love how they interact with each other. The world feels so alive when you get beaten up by some starving bandits trying to steal your food, only for them to be ironically attacked and eaten by some starving bone dogs. There's always a bigger fish. Speaking about getting beaten up, one of the things that everyone mentions about Kenshi is the unique combat system. Again, there's nothing really like it. Characters don't just swing weapons at each other until they fall over. Wherever they physically make the attack in the animation is where it damages the target. See, there's a limb system, so characters can have each limb individually damaged. This sounds like a really amazing and advanced mechanic, but if you zoom in and actually watch the combat, it's a bit of a mess. There's only a few animations for each weapon type, and so even if a swing is targeted at a specific limb, it often just phases through the rest of the body to get to it. If you were to watch the combat, you probably couldn't see what limb was being damaged, which means the whole system isn't really working as advertised. That's not to say that it doesn't work at all. The combat is still appropriately complex for a game like this, and even your character's positionings become important. Enemies with large area of effect attacks require more than just charging in with your whole squad. There was also something else to the combat that I couldn't put my finger on until I spoke to a friend about it. There's a combat slot system, so characters can't all gang up on an enemy. They seem to take turns like 90s action movie bad guys. It's not realistic, but it does encourage you to prioritize skill over numbers in your squad. The combat isn't entirely intuitive, but you do get used to it. I mentioned the lack of quests in Kenshi earlier. I think it's a very interesting design choice for an RPG. However, it might be intentional. See, there are quests in the form of loose pointers and stories. Random NPCs will tell you about some bad guy or some cache of loot, but it's not logged anywhere or marked on the map. My theory is that quests were the last thing to implement before the game was released, and the developer just decided that they would only detract from the experience. See, quests in games are a staple, but they're also incredibly bottlenecking. So, if you're going to make the ultimate sandbox RPG, why not forego them entirely? That way the narrative is truly owned by the player. It's not without its flaws. It demands a lot of attention from the player, otherwise they risk getting lost or left with a sense of directionlessness. What can be quite a big part of the Kenshi experience is the base building, and it's a little different to what you might expect. There are a multitude of ways you can play Kenshi, and one of the more time-consuming ones is building a settlement. It's a decent system. You expand and recruit more workers and eventually produce goods and weapons to use or sell. When you do have a settlement, however, the locals become a bit of an issue. If you're in God's land, then God's people will come knocking. If you're in Big Thing territory, then they will, and they knock a lot louder. The way the settlement system was done was very simple, but really clever. Managing a squad and a base might seem like a bit of a challenge, but you can issue repeatable commands to your people. It can be something simple like always first aid on nearby friendlies, but it also can be something like mine and deliver raw metal continuously. And then you can have someone who processes it repeatedly. Quickly, this becomes a whole thriving economy. It's really fun, but it does take up a lot of your attention, and can detract from you being able to go out and explore the world, which I think is the game's stronger point. The beauty of it though is that you can set up your base anywhere, even in places that make zero sense. That kind of freedom is rare. Most games would offer you the illusion of choice by just giving you predefined locations to build, but Kenshi says fuck it. If you want to build a fort in the land of acid rain, knock yourself out. Unfortunately, something that I do have to speak about is Kenshi's roughness. Although to call it rough is like calling a saw blade rough. It's incredibly jagged. But perhaps intentionally so? I don't necessarily buy into the narrative that cult classics sometimes garner. The excuse for bugs and overall jankiness as part of the experience. That bugs somehow make the game more authentic or something. They're definitely a part of the Kenshi experience, but I have no doubt in my mind that the game would be at least a little bit better without them. You could write a whole book on all the bugs and unfinished parts of Kenshi, and I'm sure that people have made lengthy videos about it. There's so many of them that I think the dev has no intention of fixing them. They're busy working on Kenshi 2 rather, which I think is the right move. Sometimes a project is just so full of holes that it's best to just leave it and learn from the experience. I'd much rather talk about another one of the game's really strong selling points, its persistent world. There aren't really any loading screens in Kenshi. About 1 kilometer of the world around the player is just always rendered, which means there's constantly all variations of enemies and neutrals moving around and interacting in that space. This works really well in conjunction with how far you can zoom the camera out. It's amazing because it gives you some really expansive open views. This does a good job of making you feel the desolation and barrenness of the world. I mean, just look how small I am. Landmarks really stand out because of this, which entices the player to explore them. The game does well in these big open spaces, however, managing the camera can be a bit of a nightmare in the more enclosed ones, like the swamps and such. Objects constantly get in the way and you'll have to continually shift the camera just to see your characters. I guess it kind of mimics what the characters are seeing in these areas. Not fucking much. The last thing I wanted to talk about was how the save system interacts with the gameplay. I've come across this problem in games before, like Vagrus the Riven Realms. It's an issue that's unique to games that are really difficult but also have really lenient save systems. You don't have to play intelligently because you can just save scum the shit out of the game. Want to travel across a dangerous region? Don't wait till the cover of nightfall, just reload the save until you make it across in one piece. Where I think it's specifically detrimental to Kenshi is that the game is about failure, narratively as well as in the gameplay. Your character gets better through failure. Save scumming every time you lose a fight might be the natural thing to do for many gamers, but it's not conducive in Kenshi. While I was writing this review, I realized more and more that Kenshi is a game that really shouldn't be as fun as it is. It's a downright mess, but I just can't get enough of it. It really shows you that passion outweighs polish every single time. In conclusion, Kenshi is a game about freedom and about failure. It is the truest sandbox experience I've ever played, in that it puts you in a world and just lets you learn. It's a tough game and I wouldn't recommend it unless you've watched a basic guide, but if you can, don't look up anything else about it. It's best experienced firsthand. All the wins and all the losses. Thanks for watching.